with.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I thank Her Excellency the Governor-General for outlining the direction and priorities of our new government, cutting taxes, reducing regulation, redefining the role of government and investing in 21st century broadband, roads and hospitals. And Mr Deputy Speaker, if there is a single philosophical thread weaving all of these reforms together, surely it is this, that we on our side of politics believe that the role of government is to enable citizens to do their best, whereas our opponents on the Labor side believe that government's role is to tell citizens what is best. And the stark difference that we see again and again through every policy area bears out the importance and the significance of this distinction and the failure of the government knows best approach, which was so apparent in the last 6 years of Labor government. Because at the touchstone of all of that is freedom. It is a belief in the individual, the belief that citizens, individuals, private businesses are best able to chart their own destiny. And we see this very clearly in my own portfolio of communications. The rise of the internet, the arrival of the internet, which became commercial, I suppose, 20 years ago and has gathered more and more momentum and more coverage, the rise of the internet has revolutionised the communications world and the media world. Our laws and regulations and assumptions were all based around a series of platforms: newspapers, magazines, licensed broadcasters, radio, television, subscription television, whether it's on cable or satellite. And these great platforms were the only means that people could communicate to the mass. They were the gatekeepers, and they posed huge barriers to competition. But then the internet came along and devastated all of that. It provided a very cost-effective platform for advertising and so undermined significantly, materially, the business model of newspapers, particularly those like the big metropolitan broadsheets of yesteryear, which depended on classified advertising. Takes on subscription television. People now can buy the programs, download the programs they want to watch when they want to watch them from the internet. They don't have to buy a bundled package. Netflix arises to take on all of the cable TV companies in the United States and its many imitators around the world. So these are revolutionary times. Now, we've all been very concerned, especially about the damage to the newspaper business, not because any of us, I hope, are so naive as to be filled with a particular affection for newspapers or journalists as a group or proprietors as a group or the shareholders of newspapers. All businesses have to deal with the travails of the world and adapt to them. But newspapers and journalists have a very fundamental role to play in our democracy, or I should say journalism does, because the work that journalists do in a free media is just as important as any work that we do here in this chamber or in the other place as legislators, or that the judiciary do, or that the public service do in running the country. We cannot be a democracy without a free media. And so the concern naturally was that as the resources were drained away from those newspapers, which had been the big foundations of journalism, so the quality of our democracy would diminish as the quality of journalism and the number of journalists, the resources available to journalism were diminished too. And that's been a matter of very real concern. But what we have also seen with the arrival of the internet is an opening up of competition on a scale that would have previously been unimaginable. If you think back 20, 30 years, the idea of there being new newspapers to compete with the Sydney Morning Herald or The Age or the Daily Telegraph or the Melbourne Herald Sun was fanciful. Every now and then some rich person would try to start their own newspaper to take on one of the established ones, but it was generally a very unsuccessful effort. I'm thinking of Lang Hancock in Perth and, of course, Robert Holmes-a-Court for a period. But what the internet has done is lowered the cost of entry into the media market. And so at the same time that we've been lamenting the demise of the great beasts of the media jungle, we have seen more competition than ever. We've seen The Guardian online, we've seen the Mail online. Now out here we've seen the paper I launched on Friday, Maurice Schwartz's Saturday paper, and so many others, a host of them, too many to name. We have never had more competition and more diversity in our media world than we have today. And yet it is remarkable, Mr Deputy Speaker, that under the previous government, their obsession was with the constructs, the technological constructs of the past. They said Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation has the majority share of metropolitan daily newspaper circulation. Well, so it has had for nearly 30 years, since the Labor government enabled Mr Murdoch to buy the Herald and Weekly Times Group. But that share of the total media and information pie represented by newspapers is getting smaller and smaller as more and more competitors come onto the scene. And yet it was precisely at that time, when a media landscape that had been frozen for decades suddenly starts to thaw and is open to so much competition, it was precisely at that time that the Labor government wanted to constrain freedom and regulate the media in a way it had never been regulated before in peacetime. And so there is a fundamental difference between the way I am approaching this portfolio of communications, and indeed the government is approaching this area, and its Labor predecessor. Labor believed that the arrival of the internet required more regulation and less freedom. We say that the arrival of the internet enables much more competition and therefore more freedom, and that therefore there is a need for less regulation, not more. You could not have a starker difference between our government and its predecessor, and the difference is that we believe in freedom. Now, I note in passing, Mr Deputy Speaker, that some commentators on the Conservative or the right-wing side of the political debate have criticised me for launching Maurice Schwartz's new paper, the Saturday paper, on Friday. They apparently would like me to be, just as Senator Conroy was, the Minister for left-wing communications, or the Minister for communications that agrees with the Labor Party. They'd like me to be the Minister for right-wing communications, or communications that agree with the Liberal Party. And that is not the case. I am the Minister for communications. I'm the Minister that seeks to ensure that we have the freest and most diverse media we can possibly manage. I'm the Minister that wants to take away the barriers to competition wherever I can, so that as many voices can speak out as possible. And whether they are left or right is of no concern to me in my capacity as the Minister for Communications. As the member for Wentworth seeking re-election, I may be disappointed if the anti-Liberal forces in the media call for me not to be elected. Fair enough, that'll be distressing at election time. But in my ministerial capacity and in my role as the custodian of this vital portfolio in the government, my job is to stand up for freedom. And those who think that this Liberal minister should be like Senator Conroy and seek to persecute or suborn or bully those that do not agree with him have got it completely wrong. They are wrong in principle and they are wrong in practice. Everybody has a vested interest in freedom. Everybody, whether you are on the right or on the left, You have a vital vested interest in freedom. And as I said in one brief comment on the weekend to one of these critics, mangling Bill Clinton, it's the democracy, stupid. It's the democracy. That's what we're committed to. Now, you see another example of the Labor Party's big government obsession in their approach to broadband. The fundamental failure or mistake of the previous government, and it was a fundamental one and one that is impossible to reverse at this juncture, regrettably, was to be mad enough, genuinely mad enough, to imagine that the government was the right agency to build a new telecommunications network. It was back to the days of the Postmaster General. Every other comparable country in the world, in approaching the challenge of getting broadband services upgraded, has done this. They have encouraged the private sector to do the job. They have provided judicious subsidies to ensure that people in remote or regional areas got their services upgraded, where it otherwise would not be commercial to do so. And the virtue of that is that it ensured that the government was up for a certain amount of money, a sum certain, and all of the execution, the construction risk and the business risk was left with the private sector. And an excellent example of that, you don't have to look very far, is what John Key did in New Zealand, or indeed what the British have done in the UK. And there's a very long list. So the craziness of the previous government's policy was right from the jump having the hubris, in defiance of experience both in Australia and everywhere else in the world, to imagine that the government was the best party to do the job. And so in Australia, in the socialist paradise of Senator Conroy and Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd, we have a situation where the execution and business risk of this vast project is entirely vested in the government, in the taxpayer in other words, and the only people that got the cheques, that got the certainty, were in fact the telephone companies, Telstra and Optus, who sold their assets to the government. An extraordinary failure, an extraordinary fundamental failure. And so it's no surprise that the project has run late, it is run over budget, and indeed, as Ziggy Switkowski observed just last week, so far the NBN Co has invested $6.4 billion of taxpayers' money, and in its fibre rollout passed less than 2% of the country. Now, the challenge that we have, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that we are not in a position to turn back the clock. We're not in a position to undo all of the mistakes the Labor Party has done. So what we have to do is to mitigate the madness and try to complete the project as quickly and cheaply and hence as affordably as possible. As I said in question time, one of the consequences of the Labor Party's approach, of course, would have been, had it been persevered with, is that broadband prices would have been up to 80% higher. Now, there's no magic in that. There's nothing unusual in that. If you have a massively expensive, over-capitalised government monopoly with no competition to keep it honest, you are going to get very, very high prices. You don't get cheap prices by over-capitalising a business, especially if it's a monopoly. And I noticed earlier the member for McEwen speaking about his electorate and saying that people had been moving away because of lack of broadband. Well, he should really raise that with his colleagues, because in 6 years of Labor, virtually nothing was done. There was the best part of 2 million premises without access to broadband in 2007, and there's only been a tiny chip into that in the intervening 6 years. And then, I might say, with a chutzpah that is quite epic, he then went on to complain that there were mobile phone black spots in his electorate? Well, no doubt there are. And that's one of the reasons why the coalition government, the Abbott government, has allocated $100 million to address them, or address as many as we can with that sum of money. But it is worth noting that in 6 years of the Labor government, not 1 cent, Mr Deputy Speaker, was spent to fix mobile black spots. And it's the same point about regional and remote broadband subsidies. It is the same point that you have areas where there is no mobile phone reception. This is, as we all know, this is by far the biggest complaint, as you would know in particular, Deputy Speaker, from your electorate of Maranoa. This is by far the biggest concern, telecommunications concern, in rural and regional Australia. And in those areas, of course, because of the small population, it's not necessarily economic for the telcos to make the investment. So there is a role for government. But in 6 years, not 1 cent was spent by Labor on upgrading or addressing mobile phone black spots, but to date $6.4 billion was invested, $6.4 billion in passing less than 2% of the Australian premises in Australia. Deputy Speaker, I've spoken earlier about the other critical issue, but it bears repeating, and it is this issue of affordability. It's no good having the best broadband technology in the world that enables people a household of 6 to engage in simultaneous high-definition interactive cyber gaming across the world. It's no point having that if battlers can't afford it. The fact the member for Chifley there is interjecting away because he doesn't like to know the truth. And the truth is there are many people in his electorate that cannot afford broadband today. And he, in his hubris, has turned his back on them, and supported a broadband policy that will make broadband less affordable than it is today. 41% of the least well-off households, the lowest income households, the lowest 20% of income households in Australia, do not have access to the internet at home. 4% of the top 20% do. So what do you reckon the difference is, Mr Deputy Speaker? I think it's all about affordability, don't you? You don't have to be a rocket scientist to work that out. And yet there was Labor, in a manner calculated, inevitably determined to make broadband less affordable than it already is. And that was the inevitable consequence. As night follows day, you overcapitalise a business and you render it immune from competition. That will result in higher prices. There is no alternative. And that is the critical objective of our government when it comes to the NBN, to get this project finished, to ensure that people everywhere have access to very fast broadband, using the mix of technologies in common with all of the other major developed countries, the United States, the UK, Germany, Belgium, France. Take your pick. Using the mix of technologies that will ensure that we have a broadband network that is built nearly 4 years sooner, $32 billion less expensively, and above all, Mr Deputy Speaker, make it more affordable. Labor's indifference, its arrogant indifference to the position of the people that it claims to represent, the least well-off Australians, is truly chilling. Really is truly chilling. Labor's policy would result in average broadband prices increasing by $43 a month, increasing by up to 80% a month. Up to 80% a month. That's the fact. There's no point. They can run around and wave their arms and talk about gigabits and gigabytes. They can do all of that, talk about all these things most of them don't understand, and yet the bottom line is this, and we all know it, whether we're in big business or little business. You give the Labor Party a project like this to manage and they will make a hash of it. You overcapitalise a government monopoly and you will get higher prices. And the consequence of that is that a vital service which has been unaffordable for many to date will become unaffordable to many more in the future.
Order. The question is that the